Welcome to the party, pal. I have Doug Bandow, who has been a long advocate for neutrality in America's foreign affairs, really going back to the 80s. He's written for antiwar.com. He's been on lots of shows talking about foreign policy with people like Scott Horton. He's been doing this for a long time. So how are you doing, Doug?
Oh, hanging in there. Crazy times.
Yeah. Doug, we're now over a year into this business with Russia attacking Ukraine. I don't, I always say, one of my friends likes to say, when in doubt, zoom out. Let's go back. We were both, we both were, came of age during the Cold War, and we were told, the Soviet Union wanted to take over the world, which might have been true to a certain extent, but, also they suffered horrible losses in World War II. All those guys had seen that. So I don't know if they necessarily wanted to take over the world, but they certainly were, they did invade Afghanistan. And then all of this came to a crash when, the end of the Soviet Union. What has happened since then? And how did we now get back to a state of Cold War between now and then?
Well, there's a great lost opportunity, and obviously it's pretty complex. When you look at the collapse of a massive country and its satellite states, its relationship with the U.S., Europe, and others. I mean, all this. There are many decision points. I mean, that's one of the problems with something like this. Is they're almost. Certainly there are probably a dozen places where a different decision by someone in some government could have easily yielded a very different result. I mean, my starting point here is, Vladimir Putin's not a good guy, and the invasion of Ukraine is a crime. I mean, we should just have that as a starting point. Is that, there's a lot of explanation that's critically important. Yeah. If we don't understand it, we're going to make these stupid mistakes again. Yeah. I don't want to suggest that justifies what happens, but I think it's very important. The American policymakers, Europeans, don't want to be held accountable for anything. They blow up Iraq and then they wander off and, kind of act as if nothing happened. They promote war in Yemen or Libya, and then they act as if it's somebody else's fault. And we're getting much the same, frankly, with the Ukraine war, with U.S. and European policymakers who, just act shocked that anybody would think anything they did might have contributed to this. While, in fact, they did, unfortunately, set up a lot of the circumstances. I mean, the collapse of the Soviet Union was an enormous good. And frankly, it shocked almost everyone. I mean, there are a lot of folks who thought the Soviet Union was in trouble. I mean, it clearly couldn't handle. These CIA surveys that had the Soviet Union with an economy that's growing and all that stuff were obvious nonsense to anybody who visited the Soviet Union. I mean, I joked at the time. Cato had a conference over there in like 1990 or something. And my joke was, they weren't even capable of making toilet paper. That even at the kind of fine commie establishments, you think they're recycling tanks to make toilet paper. I mean, this is crazy. I mean, what kind of a government is incapable of making something like that? Well, they really were. There is this kind of buildup of what the Soviets were. And the good news for us is it turns out free people, even relatively free in Western welfare states, do a lot better than people stuck in the horrible totalitarian system. And I think we had two people, I think we have to give credit to, who kind of arose at the same time, which mattered, which was Reagan and Gorbachev. Was that Reagan, despite his reputation, was horrified by the thought of nuclear war, and came to recognize that the Soviets actually were very nervous, thinking the U.S. might attack them. I mean, back in 1983, there was a famous exercise called Able Archer, where the evidence, there's a book was written on it, which is fascinating, which I read a number of years ago, about how the Soviets were really nervous that this exercise was being changed. They thought that might be the cover for a nuclear strike. And at that point, frankly, we were lucky that the West German government was permeated by East German spies, because these East Germans were reporting back to their masters, look, nothing's happening. I mean, the defense ministry in Bonn is empty. I mean, you can't plan a war if nobody's at the military offices. And that helped push Reagan wanting to negotiate. And Gorbachev clearly was a different kind of guy. I mean, Leonid Brezhnev was the longtime leader. He replaced Khrushchev. And I mean, it really was it was stagnation. It was kind of a horrible, repressive, terrible time where the Soviet Union went into decay. Then two quick secretary generals that
Yeah.
died in quick succession. I mean, they chose the KGB chief, and then he croaked. And then they chose, a really ancient, a guy named Chernenko, a very ancient
Yeah.
friend of the Brezhnev. He died. They get Gorbachev. And it turns out Gorbachev must have kept his intentions very well hidden. But he was a reformed communist, but the critical thing was he was no guy who wanted to kill people. And in the end, he was willing to release prisoners and suddenly allow freedom of speech. And at the last moment, he would not call out the troops. The Soviet Union is dissolving. People around him wanted him to round up the leaders of the republics like Yeltsin, who were breaking up the Soviet Union, and he refused. We had a breakup of the Soviet Union that went essentially peacefully. There was some attempt at a crackdown of the Baltic states. There were bad moments, but overall, you think of that evil empire, as Reagan called it. It broke up pretty easily compared to what we would think. And in Eastern Europe, the same thing happened, other than Romania, where the dictator was so bad that on Christmas Day, he and his wife, kind of co-conspirator, were found guilty. They didn't have to ask for volunteers for the firing squad. All the soldiers wanted to be on it, and they started shooting before being ordered to shoot. They hated these people so much. But otherwise, all this stuff cascades down, and lo and behold, nobody's killed, no mass killings and whatever. So there really was a moment of euphoria.
Yeah.
And I think coming out of that, two things happened which were problems. One was we underestimated the chasm between democratic capitalism, essentially, and totalitarian communism. And Soviet Union, did not have a civil society. It didn't have all of these institutions that we take for granted. People had not lived under systems where power passed peacefully. All this stuff that we take for granted wasn't there. It doesn't mean they're incapable of democracy, but it means it's much harder to make all this work. And the second was that the arrogance in the West. We won, let's go. That despite a lot of assurances that were made, and we have these in all of our archives and files, assurances made to both the Soviets and the Russians, as the Moscow transformed itself, that NATO would not expand. And so what happened then, I would say, take it from 1991, the destruction, the collapse of the Soviet Union, up through, say, essentially 2007. 2008, I think, is probably a good moment. Over that time period, what happened was that the Russians felt that they'd been lied to, that the Allies had made a lot of promises, and the problem, we look at this from our standpoint and say, why on earth would they feel threatened? We wouldn't do anything to them. But I tell people that imagine if this was what was going on in the Western Hemisphere. But we have this little thing called the Monroe Doctrine. This is spheres of influence. And we showed what we think when foreign militaries show up in our sphere. Look at Cuba in 1962. We almost had a nuclear war over that. Look at Reagan in the 1980s in terms of Nicaragua, El Salvador, Grenada, all that stuff. That was all kind of this. Oh my, the Soviets shouldn't be doing this, etc. Well, the Russians had the same view. So number one is expansion of NATO. Number two is dismantling Serbia, which is a long-time kind of Russian ally. And that had a huge impact not only on Russian elites, but the Russian population, where an attitude that had been generally pro-Western actually turned, where Russians were saying, wait a minute, what are you doing with this stuff? And then there were the color revolutions in both Tbilisi and Kyiv in terms of trying to overthrow, rather wretched rulers, but nevertheless having kind of promote Western oriented and supporting, people we think are our friends in those countries. And then take it even later was 2014, where there basically was, I would argue, a street putsch against the elected leader who was more or less pro-Russian. You put all of that together, and what the Russians saw was, number one, is NATO is lying and is kind of taking advantage of us. They said they weren't. Number two, it's aggressive. They said it's peaceful, but lo and behold, it attacks Serbia that hadn't attacked it. Later on, it kind of dismantles Libya, goes after the dictator there, etc. So the Russians look at all of this and say these people are dangerous. Then they're worried about bringing these countries into NATO, particularly Ukraine. Look at a map. You understand why Ukraine matters a lot. Historically, connection to Russia, but also a very long border, the largest of the constituent republics to break away from Russia within the Soviet Union. etc. And you can, pardon me?
Kazakhstan.
Well, Kazakhstan in terms, but even Ukraine is at least the largest country in Europe after Russia. I guess Kazakhstan might be bigger, but Kazakhstan didn't have the historical connection. It also didn't have that sense of threat because Ukraine is connected to Europe and the rest of the U.S. and whatever. Well, Kazakhstan, Central Asia, China's not going to be invading through that or something. So, and Kazakhstan, about a third of the people were Russian. I mean, it was the Russians care about it, but not the same way. And what's very interesting, if you look at Putin is a nasty guy. I mean, this is a thug. This is a guy who's in the KGB. But what's important to realize, being in the KGB doesn't mean you're a communist. The KGB tended to be the most worldly of these characters. I mean, they actually lived in other countries. He was in East Germany. East Germany had a higher standard of living than the Soviet Union. Putin's not a dumb guy. I mean, he had to realize that. So Putin, was not particularly anti-American. I mean, basically, he's pro-Russian, he's nationalist, but that doesn't mean that he is kind of ideologically antagonistic to the U.S. So he was the first person to call George W. Bush after 9/11 and offered his help. And in 2001, he gave a famous speech to the Bundestag, the German parliament, that was very accommodating. I mean, you read that today and you wonder, where did this Vladimir Putin go? Well, it went kind of where a lot of the other Russians went. With all this other stuff going on, he changed his opinion. And in 2007, he gave a talk at the Munich Security Conference, which I read it and I say, this is a very well-crafted speech. He says, what happened to all these promises about not expanding NATO? We don't look at this as very, very peaceful. He noted there was one country engaged in a lot of wars. Well, we all kind of know who that country was, right? Iraq and Afghanistan, and, he kind of blowing up places and killing hundreds of thousands of people. And oops, we didn't mean that. So you saw a very different attitude between 2001 and 2007. 2008, the Bush administration pushes very hard for a promise of NATO to bring both Georgia and Ukraine into NATO. Europeans don't want to do it. They think this is crazy. The compromise is we say that eventually they'll get in. And once Bush went out of office, frankly, nobody wanted to bring them in, but they weren't willing to repudiate the promise. So for the following 14 years, NATO consistently said, well, we're going to love you coming in someday. So the Russians keep hearing that, and they sent out a lot of signals. We really don't like this. Then in 2014 was this revolution in Kyiv. And that really mattered because Crimea, which historically was Russian, has the naval base for the Black Sea in Sevastopol. Russians are very nervous about losing that. And at the time, the polls indicated pretty clearly a majority of Crimeans would prefer to go back to Russia. What they believe today is hard to know. So basically the Russians grabbed it, and then they took part of the Don. Well, they supported separatists in the Donbass, which is in the eastern part of Ukraine. And I mean, this stuff, it's clearly Russian supported. That doesn't mean there isn't local support, but the locals probably didn't have enough support to do it without the So, I mean, he's clearly using this for political mechanism. But at the time, he didn't annex. And this then causes the U.S. and the Europeans to put sanctions on Russia. Relations get even worse. And then last year, he basically threatened to attack, wanted negotiations, and basically the U.S. dismissed his demands to talk about serious stuff, so they could talk about other things, but certainly not NATO and whatnot. And the irony in this, I argue, is that basically NATO had spent the preceding 14 years lying to everyone, right? So NATO is telling Ukraine, we love you, we want you in, but that was simply not the truth. They went for 14 years without doing anything to bring it into NATO because no one wanted to go to war to defend Ukraine. That was just the reality. Ukraine wasn't vital to anybody. Ukraine wasn't necessary for the defense of Europe or America. And everybody understood it's next door to the nuclear-armed Russians, and they don't want this, so this would be a mess. But they also said, of course, we're going to bring them in. That's what they told the Russians, too. So the Russians believe it's eventually coming in. The Ukrainians also believe it's eventually coming in. So they all act on that, which is really stupid policy. That if you're not going to bring them in, we should have told both sides we're not. Now work out and make a deal. Exactly what Putin wanted. I mean, I think if they weren't coming into NATO, if you went back 10 years and you told the Russians, look, this isn't going to happen. We got it. I mean, you really we got it. We understand the security concerns. Imagine the Russians wanting to bring Mexico into the Warsaw Pact. People in Washington would have an utter freak out. I mean, all this blather about, oh, countries should be able to do what they want, utter nonsense. They would basically be willing to bomb Mexico City to stop it. I mean, the people go nuts. So if we'd made that assurance along the way, my guess is we would not be in the position we are today. And again, I want to emphasize Putin's a bad guy. He shouldn't have attacked.
Yeah.
But we need to understand he didn't do this just because he got up one morning and said, oh, why not attack somebody? And you've got these people acting as if he's Hitler. He's going to reconstitute the Soviet Union.
Yeah.
Well, this is silly. I mean, Hitler, was in power, at least nominally in power, and by the end, he didn't rule very much. But he was in power for 12 years. He took over, much of Europe, almost all of European Russia, a big chunk of North Africa, and came close to winning other stuff. I mean, that was serious. Well, Putin, before his attack on Ukraine had, influence over Abkhazia and South Ossetia with Georgia, which long were separatists. They didn't like the Georgians. This goes back to the Russian Revolution, a lot of history there. And he had a chunk of the Donbass, more or less, where, again, he supported separatists but didn't exactly rule it, and Crimea. I mean, this is not a reconstitution of the Soviet Union. It's just not. That, there's nothing to suggest that he was crazy that he wanted to attack Europe. That we have trouble visualizing how the Russians look at this, but they were thrice invaded from the West. I mean, that's just the reality. It's Napoleon, Wilhelmine Germany, and then, Hitler Germany. And so they want protection. They don't like people up on their borders. They don't want to have an alliance on the other side. All these things are there where we may not understand why it bothers them. But quite honestly, again, I tell people, you flip it around. Imagine the Russians are, have the Warsaw Pact is in South America. They want to bring Mexico in. They stage a coup in Mexico City, throw out the pro-American government, and invite the new government to join the Warsaw Pact. People in Washington would have an utter freak out. I mean, it's just the reality. What matters is how people perceive it, not how we think they should perceive it. So it strikes me that the great tragedy here is this was eminently avoidable. And again, I think there are a lot of decision points along the way that if certain things have been done differently, certain assurances given to the Russians. I think in 2014, the Russians were prepared to live with a Ukraine that traded with both sides. That had an economic relationship with the European Union. I don't think that was a huge deal with them. But where they see the European Union wanting to kind of get exclusively pull it away, they see talk of NATO, they see what they perceive as, I think with some accuracy, a coup against their guy, by the people who claim to be Democrats, right? Yanukovych was a big corrupt guy in Kyiv, but everyone basically agrees that the election in which he was elected was a free election. Was a fair, the voting was fair. You can argue about a lot of the stuff that went on there. This is a corrupt place. Nevertheless, for some good reason, they look at that and say, you're the people who claim to be Democrats and you're overthrow the guy who was democratically elected. And basically disenfranchising a huge chunk of voters in the eastern Ukraine who had not, Kyiv is more or less in center west. It's in territory that tends to be anti-Russian, so all of the Western and all the attention, all the media are among the people who want to get rid of Yanukovych. Nobody's talking to the Russian speakers in the East who actually are very happy about this. So I think the point we are today is the first is we need to demand accountability of our own officials. And the second thing is in looking ahead of trying to get a peaceful resolution, we have to come up with something that offers security assurances to the Russians, because they have a very good reason not to trust us. I don't trust Putin, but he would be crazy to trust the Americans.
Yeah.
So the question then is, what is that, and how do you get there? And that requires us to understand how we screwed up, because the U.S. and Europeans bear enormous amount of blame, in my view, for the death and destruction being visited on Ukraine. And and right now we're essentially fighting to the last Ukrainian to weaken Russia. Seems to be the U.S. and allied policy. Give enough stuff to keep the war going, but it's very hard to imagine how Ukraine can win it. Just given, much smaller population, wrecked economy, basically dependent on aid from the West. It's going to have the idea it's going to be able to kind of fully defeat Russia, gain all the territory back, also seems unlikely. So we're in kind of a stalemate in which people are dying every day in huge numbers. It's an utterly terrible situation.
Yeah, having watched all this, and like you said, it's not been one big decision. It's been a bunch of little decisions, and uh, really, although this wasn't the case, I think the first big decision was, going into Kuwait in 1990. Although that wasn't the case, but that was the first time after the Berlin Wall fell that the USA chose to get involved, intervene in something, even though the Cold War is now over. And neither country was democratic, and certainly, and neither country is democratic now. And then it just seemed to create this ratcheting effect of, we're not going to, the Cold War is over, but we're still going to try to justify all these wars.
I mean, I think the Kuwait invasion or our intervention.
Yeah.
I mean, there are two things about it that are important. One of which is, at that point, the Soviets didn't object. So there was a good enough relationship between Bush Sr. and Gorbachev.
Yeah.
And I think they were uncomfortable, but it was presented in a way that the Russians did not, or the Soviets, soon to be Russians, did not perceive as threatening. And the second is, give credit to George H.W., is that he limited the intervention. He didn't go in and say, we've got to take out Saddam, we've got to remake the place, we've got to turn this into a democracy, all this other crazy stuff. Yeah, and he got a lot of flack for it. I mean, basically, he walked away and, no, we're not going to go in and save everybody and do this and do that. Which I think the real criminal here, criminal is probably a little strong, but no, I'm not sure too much, is the Clinton administration, President Clinton, who basically spent his entire term waging war on Iraq. In terms of, we have no-fly zones and we're bombing. Well, and the question is, for what? It turns out they didn't have weapons of mass destruction. The army had been decimated. What was, and I think it was that kind of, we're going to remake this place. We're going to change, and I think that helped create this. It's that arrogance of international social engineering. And, George H.W. Bush commented at one point, what we say goes. I think it was Clinton who really put it into action, when it came to Iraq. And then did the same thing in the Balkans. Again, if you're thinking about what really angered the Russians, it was to have the alliance that claimed to be defensive launch a war against Serbia, that had nothing to do with defending anybody in the West, and then trying to set up a scheme that excluded the Russians. So you had this comic opera. The Russians had some forces in Bosnia as part of the Bosnian settlement. No country around them would allow overflight to Russian planes. So the Russians drove troops from Bosnia into Pristina, the capital of Kosovo. And that's the moment where Wesley Clark, the head of NATO, the commander of NATO, told his British second in command, who was on kind of at the spot, to prevent the Russians from getting in. And I think it was General Jackson, I think was his name, said, I'm not starting World War III for you. To his great credit, it's like, are you out of your frigging mind? You want me to shoot at Russians? Whatever. But that was huge, because that war convinced the Kremlin and Russian public that the Allies were aggressive militarily, that all this cant about, we're only defensive. It's like, well, wait, we see you here. We see what you're doing. This is defensive. And so I think Clinton, I understand your point on, I opposed it. The first war, but to me, the real destruction of that relationship between Washington and Moscow came under Clinton, and they really started the expansion of NATO, and just without any concern about Russians. It's kind of like they lost tough, and to me, that's the point where you realize, right now they can't do anything. 20 years later, guess what? We found out they can.
Yeah. It's almost like it's some kind of addiction to a drug. And, before you took one hit and now you got to take 2 hits, and then you take 3 or 4 hits. And they just keep getting addicted to it until it destroys them. I knew people who lived there, and people would just say to me, there's no good guy in the former Yugoslavia,
Yes, exactly.
It is unfortunate, it is true, though, that most of the, Russia has never had its Magna Carta. It's never had a John Locke.
Yep.
it's never had anything like that. I don't know if Russia ever, and I don't know how you get to bring Russia into how Russia ever becomes that. But at the same time, obviously Russians are going to look at America and say, well, why do so many more of those people in that country have cars? Why do they have these fancy gadgets that we don't have? And even Putin's going to see this, and I think Russia's always looked to Western Europe more, just because Russia has always been somewhat behind the rest of Europe. It's technologically or anything like
that. I mean, what the
Yeah.
U.S. and the West did was not only, I mean, it was politically, we want to support Yeltsin, didn't matter. 1990, again, people complain about Russia allegedly meddling in the U.S. election. Well, I mean, the new reports out, I mean, by Durham, the attorney, I mean, it's been pretty evident that this is stuff cooked up, by the Clinton campaign. And, I mean, and like I am quite prepared to believe that the Russians do bad things, just like the Chinese do in the North Korea. I mean, fine. But the notion that somehow they've managed to change the election is just hard to believe. And there was a study by the Carnegie Mellon Institute, that looked at, regime change kind of operations, interfering with elections between 1945 and 2000. And the U.S. was way in the lead, interfering in more than 80 democratic elections. One of those was Russia in 1996. There was a famous Time magazine cover of like a Yankee Doodle figure, and talking about all the stuff. I mean, we pressured the IMF to put money in a loan that Russia was not eligible for under the normal criteria. I mean, what the U.S. and again, short-sighted. I mean, at the time, you kind of understand what they're saying. Oh my God, we can't let the communists come back. Doesn't matter. This guy's a drunk and incompetent. Got to keep him in office. But of course, that meant they had somebody in office who was not up to the job. The second was the privatization of the economy. It had to be privatized, but the way it was privatized, it essentially turned over most of the economy to elites, to the nomenclatura, to the political. I mean, people kind of grabbed chunks of the economy. It's where you got what they call the oligarchs. So normal Russians came out of that just seeing kind of a kleptocracy.
Yeah.
That they were worse off. Production has dropped. I mean, all welfare state's gone. All this stuff has happened. Then they see these people driving around in $200,000 cars. So liberals, in the sense that we understand them, classical liberals, people who want a free society, were basically wiped out of politics because they were all identified with the West, and that's where Putin comes in. And Putin initially seemed open to a lot of free market stuff. He had a free market guy around him, who subsequently left, came to America. So the Russians are looking at this experience saying, yeah, we tried democracy, we tried capitalism. Boy, those didn't work out. Well, where do you go if you're turning away from that? And unfortunately, it's nationalism, it's authoritarianism, it's statism. They've got all that now in spades.
Yeah, they do. And the saddest part in all this, Doug, is, I don't think America no longer has any moral high ground anymore. I think 30 years ago we sort of did, but we don't anymore. And I had Karen Kitowski on here, and I just said to her, talked to her about, the state of the American military. And I said to her, Putin has to know this, and he has to be laughing his ass off at the situation in this country now.
Yeah, look, I mean,
we couldn't fight World War II now, is my main point.
Well, there's a lot that's scary. In terms of political divisions here, in terms of craziness of, a hard left woke culture. I mean, there's a lot that really is scary. And look, I think the problem is that we have elites who do very well in this system and rig it well and live well. And we have a lot of folks who look at that and say, I'm left out. And yeah, this is supposed to be a democracy, but it doesn't matter how I vote. Nothing changes in Washington, right? I mean, I vote Republican or Democrat, spending keeps going up. Disasters keep happening. We keep having stupid wars. Family members die in some country. I have no idea where it is. I don't know why we're fighting there. American money is squandered on, whatever. And I think that really is a huge problem for the American political system. That internationally, I tell people I don't mind hypocrisy in diplomacy. It's always been there. Yeah, I mean, of course, everybody's a hypocrite. I mean, my goodness, Europeans, Americans, doesn't matter who. But American diplomats and American policymakers seem to be uniquely sanctimonious. That is, they do what others do, but claim the moral high ground. I mean, preach. I mean, I joke that, you said Michael Pompeo goes over and tears coming down his eyes of the terrible things the Iranian government does, and it's a monstrous government. Then he flies into Riyadh and he does a face plant, kowtow to the floor, kisses the feet of Mohammed bin Salman, who chops up his critics, and announces he's going to be a mob consigliere and prevent anybody from going after this guy, even after he's murdered people, invaded his neighbors, kidnapped a prime minister, supported jihadist guerrillas. Whatever. I mean, he buys American weapons. Merchants of death do well. Why should we criticize this poor guy? Let the killer prince go on. So there's not much credibility in that. And I think this is where the U.S. and Europeans found a bit of shock with the Ukraine war, where without even, it's just this natural assumption. I mean, look, I live right outside Washington. I mean, it's overwhelming. I mean, if you just, after COVID, I started, because everything's kind of shut down, I started watching online webinars. And I turn them on and then I go do email or other stuff and kind of half listen. And it's endless and it's all the same. I mean, every webinar is filled with people who want to have a better relationship with whatever country it is. We need to give them more money. We need to defend them more. We need to strengthen our relationship. It's always, we must do more and give more. No, American people don't even factor into that. And the assumption was that the U.S. and Ukrainians would declare, Russia is evil. The world will stand behind us. This is a great global crusade. And then they went to foreign countries and everybody said, up yours. The 10 most populous countries, only one has sanctions on Russia, and that's us. China doesn't. India doesn't. Indonesia doesn't. Pakistan doesn't. Nigeria doesn't. And all of a sudden, we're demanding they do this stuff, and they're all saying, you're nuts. This isn't our, where were you when millions of people were dying in the Democratic Republic of Congo? You were busy and couldn't care less. Why are you talking to us? Look what you did. Look what you did to Iraq, right? Violated international law, invaded another country, triggered a sectarian conflict, hundreds of thousands of people die. And does anybody pay a price? So Western policymakers have all been rather shocked by this and have had to say, oh, well, maybe we need to do something. But they don't know what to do. I mean, and so I think you're absolutely right. I mean, we don't have a leadership. We don't have moral authority. Other countries have no particular reason to follow us. And I mean, the American people understandably are horrified. I mean, this is not what the founders intended. This kind of a regime, kind of distant from the people, utterly kind of separate from their interests. I mean, we joke about the blob in Washington, foreign policy establishment. It doesn't rule for Americans. It rules for something else.
Yeah, and of course, I'm reminded of that Michael Ledeen quote. You probably know, every 10 years or so, the U.S. needs to pick up some crappy little country and throw it against the wall just to show the world that we mean business. I mean, what in the... Yeah, I mean, where do you... There's almost some kind of delusions of godhood among these people.
No, it's the ultimate in arrogance.
Yeah.
That has always struck me as one of those extraordinary moments where people are revealing their insides very clearly.
Yeah.
That there are people who live there, right? I mean, but they don't matter. I mean, and there are a lot of this. I mean, it's Madeleine Albright when asked about the death of 500,000 Iraqi babies, because of sanctions. As Leslie Stahl, 60 Minutes, asks her about this, and Madeleine Albright says, "We think the price is worth it." Oh, of course. America gets to decide to kill 500,000 Iraqi babies. What's the big deal, right?
Yes.
I mean, James Jeffrey, was a diplomat, weirdly, a never Trumper who was appointed to run Syria policy, admitted that he misled Trump on the presence of troops because they didn't want him to pull them out. And he supported sanctions. I mean, they're killer sanctions on Syria because he wanted to turn Syria into a quagmire for the Russians and basically prevent reconstruction in Syria. So here's a country that's gone through 10 years, more than 10 years of civil war. People today are almost starving. I mean, utterly wrecked. Well, who cares, right? I mean, we're going to put sanctions on because we want to punish the Russians. No one cares what happens to the Syrian people. So what? I mean, it's this extraordinary. So you see this again and again in policy attitudes. I mean, we'll get rid of Maduro. We will starve the Venezuelan people who are already starving, and that'll get rid of the wait, how does that work? Well, guess what? It didn't work. Yeah, but don't worry, we'll do it again. We'll put more. I mean, there's never. I mean, we do it in Iran, we do it in North Korea, we do it in Cuba 60 odd years later.
Yeah, and really the biggest issue is the Nord Stream pipeline.
Yeah,
that just and it's like they want to feel like they're. It's almost more and more they just want to feel like they're doing something big, no matter what the results are, and I don't think they care, even if it's billions of people getting killed.
Well, I think that they're filled. The hubris is overwhelming. I mean, Madeleine Albright had this. I wrote this up once. She had like a half dozen of these crazy quotes. I mean, the one to Colin Powell was, "What's the use of having this wonderful military if we don't use it?" I mean, this is a guy who served in Vietnam and had people die. I mean, she's just, whatever. I mean, my nephew's a SEAL. And it's like, excuse me, I mean, if he's got to do something, okay, but you don't just say, well, we have him in uniform. Let's just whatever. But one of Madeleine Albright's other quotes was, basically, we stand taller, we see further, right? We Americans, and meaning the blob, meaning members of the Washington establishment, we, could see the future, which means that's why we have to act and make these decisions and lead the world. And they believe that. Well, I mean, you look at the last 20 years in the Middle East, anyone who believes Americans, policymakers know anything? I mean, this is the Iraq was a catastrophic war. Then throw on top of that Yemen, add on Libya. I mean,
yeah.
What? So, but none of that matters. Well, next time we'll get it right. I think, and it's very hard to explain, but it's just overwhelming hubris that none of that matters. We know the future. We know what has to be done irrespective of the cost, and we rarely pay the cost. That's the important thing. When we blow up a country or blowing up another country, not America, some service people die, but Washingtonians don't have a lot of contact with them. So that's unfortunate and happens. And it's somewhere else. I mean, Lindsey Graham commented about, well, we might have to have a war with North Korea over nuclear weapons. Yeah, it'd be terrible, but at least it would be over there. It wouldn't be over here. I mean, you think South Koreans like hearing that? So what if hundreds of thousands of South Koreans died? They're not Americans.
Yeah. It brings up this question. Two questions somebody asked me. It said, would I be willing to fight in this war? And would I be willing to have this war fought in my neighborhood?
Yes.
And if the answer to that is no, if you answer no to both of those, then you probably shouldn't be fighting for them. And I've known people who have volunteered to go over to help out with refugees, and I'm saying, and my attitude is good for you. I think that's great. I there's nothing wrong with that. A guy who used to be a friend who's a doctor who's went over a couple times just to do medical treatment. I visited Tbilisi last August, and even though I'm way past military age, I've said to some of them, if you're attacked, what can I do? Because I love that place.
It's a great city.
Yeah, it's a great city, and Doug, there's something else too. The only time in my life I've went to any kind of Liberty event in which it was at least half female or possibly more.
Interesting. That's that actually is quite striking. Yeah.
There was a lot of optimism there. And I realized that small countries tend to rise and fall a lot faster, and they seem like they were really going in the right direction. And believe me, and I've become, and when people say, "Oh, you went to Georgia and Russia," I said, "No, not Russia," which is why I've now adopted this policy, really, of just calling it Sackart-Fellow, because that's what they call it. Just the same way the Germans call, their country Deutschland. It's because I get tired of correcting people and saying, no, right. I didn't go to plan on, But anyway, it's a great country. Yeah, there's and they had Ukrainian flags up everywhere.
Oh, yeah. No, I mean, I think, and they've taken in a lot of Russian refugees, people trying to.
Oh yeah, and I would certainly, if I'm I think some of these movements probably are stirred up by the CIA or whoever, but in some cases, I think they're legitimate movements that are just saying, oh, they want to America wants to give us some money. Well, yeah, sure, we'll take that money. it's and that's kind of the thing, and as we've learned from history, some of these people take the money and just do what they want anyway, which of course is the case with Bin Laden and Al Qaeda. I mean, they did what they took the money and still did what they wanted anyway. So it's not like there's any accountability here.
No, I mean, like a lot of the democracy activists in other countries, in many cases. I mean, these are people who suffer extraordinary repression.
Oh yeah,
and while the U.S. on occasion supports them, it also on occasion supports the other guys. I mean, we give lots of money to Al-Sisi in Egypt. He is worse than Mubarak, who ruled for 30 years or whatever it was. I mean, he's put more people in prison. I went there twice on human rights trips. Mubarak tolerated NGOs that kind of reported on abuses. I mean, we talked to, for example, we went to an anti-torture NGO that had been active for years, and it provided counseling and medical services. It filed lawsuits. It did all this troublemaking, and Mubarak put up with it. Al-Sisi shut it down. So, and this is a government that collects all this money from the United States. So the question is why? Yeah. I mean, you can make the argument way back when they made peace with Israel and all that, but guess what? That's like 50 years ago. So why are they getting it now?
Bribe Egypt so they don't fight Israel. Yeah, that's a good question. Who is the worst dictator that the U.S. has ever supported? I mean, that's a tough one.
Well, it's very tough. Look, the U.S. supported Saddam Hussein when he attacked Iran.
Yeah.
I mean, the U.S. supported the Shah of Iran. The U.S. now supports the Saudi royal. I mean, there's a long list. I mean, Mobutu Sese Seko of Zaire. Oh, my goodness. One of the most corrupt.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, you just go down the list. I mean, geez. Yeah. There are a lot of them. And look, foreign policy is messy. Sometimes you have to make difficult choices. I got that. But the critical thing is sometimes you don't have to do anything. That is, you don't have to make a choice. You just have to hang out. These are all bad people. Okay, we're just not going to get in.
Yeah, there's no point in getting involved with a lot of these African countries because they're not a threat to us at all.
That's exactly right. Yeah,
I don't think there are that many. Most of these countries I don't think have the ability to launch a war. I mean, especially this far away, and we've managed to have peace on the northern border since 1814 and peace on the southern border since 1846. So we've actually done pretty well. Maybe if you look at some of the things Wilson did, maybe that doesn't count, but still,
we're the most secure. We're the most secure great power that has ever existed.
Yeah, we are. Yeah,
and that's why we can wander around the world blowing up things. In contrast to everybody else, we dominate our region without question.
Yeah.
I mean, there are fish east and west and weak Pacific neighbors north and south.
Yeah.
I mean, that nobody, I mean, if you grew up in Europe, you had a dozen countries and everybody's fighting everybody. The alliances are constantly changing. You're Russia, you're getting invaded by the Europeans. Yeah. You're China. Over the last century, China has fought Russia, Japan, Korea, Vietnam, and India. They have 14 countries on their border.
Yes,
that's true. But,
yeah, we have to. Yeah,
so,
there's a history. I fully understand why my Polish friends are rooting for Ukraine, because they had grandparents or were great grandparents who got killed by Russians. It's okay. I get it. Yeah, it's and some of these things, unfortunately, really often do just amount to larger scale family feuds.
I think Americans should support causes they believe in. I mean, I gave some money early on to it's a charity that does work. It's in, I think, particularly in Poland, but it does work for Ukraine. It's called Raison. Yeah, in my view, there is help these people. I mean, that's perfectly reasonable. Separate question is, what should U.S. policy do? What risk should we take? Well, I mean, so we need to try to separate some of that human sympathy, which is real and justified, from necessarily policy making, which can get us into really deep doo-doo.
I realize that maybe I tend to be more cynical than other people, but there's a part of me that thinks if we get heavily involved in this war, it might finally put this country out of its misery. I mean, it's almost like some of the like the good Germans were thinking in 1942. the only way we get out of this is to lose the war. And they were right.
The problem here is, I mean, to get in, the way we would lose a war would be nuclear. I mean, the Russians don't have the conventional strength.
Yeah.
And they basically have a lower nuclear threshold. We just don't want to go there. I mean, to my mind, that's why you want to try to end the conflict. And I understand your point. Yeah. At some point, crisis might, you hope, kind of pull out all that stuff, force us to restart. But given the stakes, I worry very much. People who told us Putin wouldn't attack now say, "Don't worry, he'd never use nuclear weapons." Well, I'm not quite so sure. I mean, if he thought he was going to lose, if he thought they're going to take Crimea, I mean, we really are playing for huge stakes. We've never been. That's what worries me about China as well, is that we've never had a conventional war between two major nuclear powers, and we saw. I mean, the things could have gone very bad in the Cuban Missile Crisis. I mean, where Russian subs were thinking about downing, taking out U.S. destroyers. U.S. destroyers are thinking about dropping depth charges on Russian subs. I mean, Russian commanders in Cuba, Soviet commanders in Cuba, had authority to use, tactical nuclear. I mean, you're just like, and U.S. generals were saying we should invade. I mean, we were very lucky that, Kennedy, for a lot of reasons we don't have to like him, but, was willing to push back on the generals and say, oh, no, we're not doing that. So that's where, I got your point, but I think that we're just at a point with thousands of nuclear weapons floating around. We just don't want to go into
it. Yeah. Do you think the Cuban Missile Crisis is why they removed Khrushchev, by the way?
I think that it was one of several reasons. That is, number one is, of course, everybody wants to aggrandize power. So you see an opportunity, you want to do it. He was weaker. There'd been an attempt to remove him before. He had military support. Military helped fly in Central Committee members, and he won the vote. By this time, he was doing things, frankly, good stuff, in that he didn't want to spend as much on the military. He was trying to do consumer goods and agriculture. So he didn't have quite the same level of military support. So he was weaker. And the other thing, he was viewed as being volatile and unpredictable. Cuban Missile Crisis was part of that. That is even, his fellow Politburo members are thinking, this guy really took us to the brink, and this got kind of ugly,
Yeah.
And publicly it looked like they lost, even though there was in fact a trade with the American missiles in Turkey, which we never wanted to talk about. That in fact the Soviets got what they wanted and got rid of those missiles. That still publicly it looked like a great defeat for the Soviet Union. So I think that really added. But there was a lot of resentment and whatever before that helped crystallize it.
But he was the one Soviet dictator who was removed with
yes.
all the others just they were in there until they died.
They didn't kill him. They basically he lived out in retirement at a dacha.
Yeah.
So the old Stalin era was over.
Yeah.
But he was the one who was kind of, thank you, your services are no longer needed.
Yeah. But in some ways there are parallels, because I remember when Jeff Tucker made that sarcastic tweet, it said, "Who are you voting for in 2024, Andropov or Chernenko?" And it's like we have our country being ruled by all these people who are old, just like they were in the Soviet Union. The parallels between America now and Soviet Union in the 1980s really seem very obvious there. I don't know.
Yeah, stagnation, stalemate.
I don't know how much longer this can go on.
No, it was amazing. You're thinking about Biden, thinking about Pelosi, you're thinking about Mitch McConnell. Schumer's, I think, 69 or something. It's kind of like, don't we have anybody younger to? Don't we have anybody with any new ideas? Anybody open? What? Why? Why do we keep reelecting these horrible people who failed? It's not as if they brought us prosperity. They failed. It doesn't matter. Yeah, it is an interesting kind of comparison. We start thinking, Chernenko and Andropov, where you're going down the line thinking, okay, how many of the? Reagan's famous comment, which was funny, was, well, I'd love to meet with them, but they keep dying on me. He's kind of like, boom, we've gone through 3, in the past 2 years. What do you do?
Yeah, that's and that's kind of a Reagan-esque joke too. Yeah, I didn't hear that one. It's
Oh yeah, no, I mean, and of course he had the way to tell it with all the
yeah.
he how the timing and everything. So it was funny.
Well, yeah, and Reagan had been in the military himself, too. I think, and obviously, being in World War II, he certainly had friends who had.
Well, look, the critical thing was that he was not understood, but that he didn't want war. He hated the thought of war. I mean, he turned out he was a big peacenik. I mean, he was horrified. You're talking to, kind of within the military establishment, like, okay, if the Soviets shoot off their missiles, what can we do? Well, nothing, actually. We just have to shoot ours off and kill them. And I mean, and he was genuinely horrified at the thought that all I can do is commit mass murder. I mean, he understood that this is no option, that to come to me as president and say, you want me to kill millions of people, which won't stop anything. I mean, wow. I mean, and when that to me, that's why Gorbachev and he were both important, that he bucked the conservatives. I mean, he was attacked as an appeaser. Oh my goodness. The comments of, I mean, from the neocons to the kind of the new right. Oh, I mean, he's been kind of sold out. And he was willing to buck all that. And he said, well, cram it. He thought there was a difference, and off he went.
Is it fair to say, though, that they just wanted to keep the defense spending going, and that's why?
No, see, I think that interests matter, but I think that it's so easy for people to believe that what they are doing is in the public interest as well as benefiting themselves, right? I mean, I don't think that Dick Cheney wanted the Iraq war because of Halliburton or something. I think Cheney was out. I mean, Cheney believed in it. I mean, but I think that a lot of this stuff comes together. I mean, the military establishment, I mean, industrial establishment, I mean, are extraordinarily influential in promoting, right? You've got to buy our weapons, horrible stuff. There's a famous, when Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait, there was a military contracting convention going on. I think it was in Michigan. I eventually tracked down a reference to it. And like the MC, when the news broke that this had happened, the MC, raised a glass in toast. Thank you, Saddam Hussein. Because they all see this proves how much we're needed. Now, did that mean they really wanted? Well, I mean, I think it's so easy to mix this stuff. You believe you're an essential advocate of, I mean, so I just think it tends to be more complicated. That there are some folks out there, I don't have any doubt, are complete cynics, but I think most people, it mixes, and that's what makes it tougher. Because if you really believe in it and you have a financial interest in it, it's really, really hard to stop.
Yeah. There's still these, I think Wilson had this Moses complex.
Yeah.
He just wanted to stand up on Mount Sinai and issue commandments to everybody.
Yes. I mean, he really was a thing apart. I mean, he went, he traveled throughout Italy to tell the Italians why they should give up, their territorial claims. So by the end of his trip, they hated him. He went there and they were kind of, oh, this is God. This is our. Now, I mean, the joke at the time was he was waiting for a vacancy in the Trinity. That he thought that was the place for him. I mean, he was one of the most sanctimonious. I mean, jerks. I mean, oh my goodness, awful on civil liberties, awful on war.
He was our, as pointed out, he was the only PhD president we had. It's I don't know if there's something about that makes a difference or not, but this whole it's all very sanctimonious, and
in
some cases I think it is just wanting to profiteer, but the problem is they also make a natural alliance,
I mean, they're much more powerful together.
And when you can be sanctimonious and turn it into a money making machine, it's really hard to fight. It's
well, one of the most dramatic moments that I saw that in operation was at Fox News. This is back in like 2004, I think, or something, where it was like they just held an election in Iraq after the invasion, and the first vote occurred. So Fox News bring their two of us in to have a conversation. And what they do is they don't put you in the studio together. I mean, we're both in both in the Washington office, but we're in separate studios on the same floor. They just have the pictures of us up. And it turns out as we finished, we came out together. We just met each other in happenstance. Oh, hi, we started talking. Now, during the program, I had suggested that, I don't think this is going to solve all the problems. And he was, oh, this is wonderful, blah, blah, blah. As we're walking out, he turns to me and says, I just got back from Iraq. And, talking to the grunts there, it's really horrible. It's just a disaster. And the best thing that could happen to us is if the Iraqis would ask us to leave. And I just stood there thinking, you were just on the tube telling the American people it's all going great. You figure this is a guy who, number one, he's got military retirement. He's got good Pentagon connections. He's probably on some corporate boards, some of the merchants of death. And he's a Fox, he's got a retainer. So they call him in. All of that disappears if he starts trashing, right, what's going on. His buddies at the Pentagon won't call him again. He'll be off the boards, and Fox won't want him on the network. So he goes up there, just says this stuff that he admits is utterly untrue. No wonder the American people thought everything's wonderful. People like him are just saying, "Oh yes, everything's great." I mean, it was stunning, absolutely stunning.
It's very stunning, and I have to ask myself, why do the people in any country allow this? Why do Americans allow it? Why do the Russians allow it? Why?
But it's hard if the media doesn't report it. It's hard where there are issues that most people don't pay much attention to. It's hard if essentially the entire policy-making elite is united on this, with a few outliers. I mean, what think tank in Washington other than Cato and, say, the Quincy Institute? I mean, maybe Institute for Policy Studies, which is on the left. Maybe those three, criticize the war and, all the stuff. But, all the mainline think tanks, Brookings, AEI, Atlantic Council, CSI, oh my goodness. They're all for all this stuff. We did an event, 20-year anniversary event at Cato on the Iraq War, and we figured that only Cato, and I think it was the Carnegie Endowment, excuse me, had opposed the war. And the then president, she's now retired, Jessica Matthews Tuckman, told a story of one of her vice presidents was approached by somebody from some other think tank and asked that person why her institute was opposing the war, and they said, "You're never going to get a job in this city again." Kind of like, if you don't go along with the program. How do American people even find out what's going on? Eventually they see body bags coming home, but that's 5 years too late or something.
Yeah, I think social media can be a positive thing in that, because every time something happens or I read a news story, I'll go to, I have a Facebook friend who lives there. I'll go ask them, "Hey, what's going on?" You have these connections and they may seem superficial, but every once in a while I do that. And, you end up with having these friends all over the world, and you can.
I think that's right.
People.
It gives us greater hope
if you use it right. Yeah. What do you think is going to happen with the situation right now? The war, and where are we going to go from here? Do you think that this war would be going on if Trump had been reelected or not?
I don't think that. The question. The problem. One of the big problems here is the left having tried to use Russia against Trump made it harder for Trump to do anything sensible in terms of Russia policy. But I think would Trump have responded differently, to a demand by Putin to negotiate? Indeed, I would imagine that Putin would probably not. Putin would have made an approach for negotiation differently, and it's possible Trump would have responded positively. And if Trump had been reelected, he would have appointed people who are much more in sync with him, as opposed to the first term where, John Bolton, I want to blow up the world. Why on earth would Trump claims he doesn't want to do that? Why would he have this person, there? Almost all the people in the foreign policy side that Trump appointed were inveterate hawks, which so even if you credit Trump with more peaceful intentions, which to some degree is true, he didn't have the people around him. So I think that assumed Trump's reelected, he had chooses Secretary of State, Defense Secretary, people who were much more in sync with what he was arguing for. I could imagine that Putin would have made an effort without putting all the troops out and without all the big stuff saying, look, we got a big problem here. I have to do something unless something happens. You might very well have found a U.S. much more willing to have a serious negotiation. And if that's the case, at the very least, that might have caused Putin to step back and give some time to try to make that process work. Now, whether it would have, what the outcome would have been, what the Europeans would have done, who knows? But I do think that there's at least a possibility that we would have had a different outcome that, at least in the short term, would have put off a conflict as opposed to getting us into it last year.
Yeah, where do you think, how do you think this ends, and where do you think we go from here after this?
Oh, I think it's scary. I think at some point the U.S. and Europeans have to basically tell the Ukrainians, okay, this is the limit of what we're prepared to give you. You've got to be able to have some negotiation. And my hope is, and I don't know if it's being done, is that there's some back channel talks with the Russians saying, look, we realize everybody screwed this all up. You need to have some assurances. What can we work out, in terms of what can you live with? What will give you sufficient view that we've committed not to, say, expand NATO? I mean, there's a NATO meeting coming up in July. The Ukrainians want in it. The U.S. and Germany and others clearly don't want to do that. So I think that there's a lot of that going on, where at some point the U.S. and Europeans have to indicate a limit on what they're prepared to do for Ukraine. And then, the question is, what happens on the battlefield? I mean, I do think that if Ukrainians recognize they can't win it all, and hopefully the Russians also have that recognition, then you have hopes of some talks. And actually, China might be useful. If China would like to have a diplomatic triumph, the Chinese, I don't think, are happy to have the Russians doing all this, but they don't want the Russians to lose. Russians might trust them. But I think we're at a military more or less stalemate. We'll see where this counteroffensive, if it happens, goes. The worst thing would be to have the war drag on another year or two or three. I mean, it's wrecking Ukraine, and it's causing a lot of Russian casualties. I mean, it's disastrous. So I hope that we can see the U.S. and Europeans be serious. And, basically Ukrainians can make their own decisions, but it doesn't mean they get our support for whatever they decide. I think that has to be clear to them.
Do you think we might see more countries adopt, a more Finland-style approach to foreign policy? I mean, Finland is one country that, everybody's, it's a lot like Switzerland. They're really prepared to go to war, but it seems like the other countries aren't doing that.
Well, Finland showed how you can have a free democratic system and limit your foreign policy ends. And that is between basically the end of World War II and the collapse of the Soviet Union. Soviets, eventually won their war against the Finns, but didn't take it over. They wanted security guarantees for, then Leningrad, now, St. Petersburg. They wanted a foreign policy that was consistent with Soviet aims, but they had no interest in ruling Finland. So I think to some degree, that's what you probably need to have happen with Ukraine. Free and internal institutions, free to trade with whoever it wants, but military neutrality and not adopting a foreign policy viewed as threatening to Russia. I think that would have prevented a conflict in the past. That probably has to be part of getting the Russians to stop the war unless they actually lose it, which I think is unlikely.
What do you think is the future of the European Union and all these other super states after this? The EU just seems like it's another corrupt super state. It's not about free trade. It's just about regulating trade and transfer schemes from one country to another.
It really has transformed from the old common market was more about free trade. I mean, now the problem with it is it really is kind of, a lot of people at least within the bureaucracy, the bureaucrats, want a consolidated government rather like the United States. They want Brussels to be like Washington, to be able to order everybody around. I mean, so far they can't control, budgets. They can't control internal affairs, despite a lot of regulatory authority. My guess, it's going to be hard to dismantle. I mean, it hands out a lot of cash. So there are a lot of countries that like what they get. And Brexit turned out to be pretty rough on the UK. So a lot of other countries are hesitant to follow down that route. But I think there's going to be continued resistance to attempts to extend Brussels control over. Can you imagine? Who in the Bundestag in Germany wants to turn over budget decisions to a bureaucracy in Brussels? So I suspect that as long as the European Union doesn't go that far, it'll probably hang together. They could lose another country or two. I think they're going to be reluctant to bring in other members. I mean, a Turkey, I mean, that would be so dramatically change the EU. I doubt it's going to happen. So they're going to be in tension, I think, for quite some time. But I think it's probably going to survive.
I've always loved this quote from Thomas Jefferson. He wrote this to James Monroe in 1823. I have ever deemed it fundamental for the U.S. never to take part in the active quarrels of Europe.
Yep.
Their political interests are entirely distinct from ours. Their mutual jealousies, their balance of power, their complicated alliances, their forms and principles of government are all foreign to us. They are nations of eternal war. All their energies are expended in the destruction of their liberty, property, and lives of their people. I think you could, unquote, I think you could also apply that to the Middle East, but how do we get back to that?
No, you're right. Look, I mean,
Washington's
famous farewell address has the same kind of sentiments, and I have written about how that should be applied to the Middle East. I mean, you shouldn't have unnatural, antipathy towards some countries and favoritism towards others. That attaching yourself to their struggles is extraordinarily dangerous. We need to make that case that ultimately, I think ultimately Washington is operating on behalf of interest groups and other countries and governments, not on behalf of the American people in a lot of these decisions. And we want a government that puts Americans first, not in some crude isolationist, nobody else in the world matters sense, but in the sense that the U.S. government's purpose is defending Americans and protecting, kind of against foreign threats. It's not to manipulate the world, run the world, et cetera, et cetera. And we need political officials, and we need to get the public to vote on that. We need public officials who stand for that, as opposed to just kind of letting Washington run riot, which is what it's doing now. Policies are made with very little consideration of American people's interests, and the American people don't care about international affairs until it really comes home and somebody's dead. So unfortunately, Washington does what it wants.
Yes, it seems to do whatever it wants, and I don't know I'm not sure what we can do to change it, unless it eventually just gets to the point where we can't spend the money anymore. But we spend, we keep spending the money, so that's another thing that just keeps going on.
Yeah, and the money may eventually force change. I mean, the numbers are extraordinary. We're already at 100% of GDP of publicly owned federal debt. By 2050, it'll be close to 200%. Greece collapsed. Had the financial crisis at about 140%. There's some point it can't go on. So
but that's why, speaking of money, Doug, someday I think we won't have passports anymore. We'll just say I'm a member of Bitcoin Nation, or somebody else is a member of Ethereum Nation or Cardano Nation or Litecoin Nation, and our nationality will just be whatever cryptocurrency we use. And whether or not we'll be able to finance wars, I don't know. But that's one thing that definitely is, fueled the war machine is, when you print the presses and just keep
absolutely
nothing. It's
after 9/11, we're told to go shop. Don't worry, we can piss away trillions and trillions of dollars and thousands of lives. Go shop. That'll be fine.
Yeah. Anything else you want to have left to say before we go, or?
I've enjoyed the talk. I appreciate you having me on. We need to find a way to put these issues central to the American people. I just came back from a leisure trip, kind of a package tour with a lot of people who are just good Americans from around the country. They're in Kentucky, they're here, they're there, and they have normal lives. So for them, they're kind of aware of this stuff going on. They're kind of skeptical of stuff overseas, but it's hard for them to become specialists, and they're focused on their own lives. We have to be able to present to them why these issues matter and why they threaten them. That unnecessary wars mean their kids, their brothers and sisters and parents are going to end up dying. We're going to end up bankrupt. All these things, we got to be able to do better at telling the American people why it all matters. Because, unless they get involved, we're going to be stuck with the same crew. We're going to have the Andropovs and the Chernyenkas still running us, in the next the next election and the elections afterwards.
Well, yeah, that's another factor too, Doug. A lot of these more modernized countries, they're old. When I just heard that in 2030, half of all Americans are going to be over 65, it's like, who's going, because if young men go to war, who's going to fight these wars?
Oh, listen, this is Europe, it's Japan, it's China, it's
China.
South Korea. About the only place that's really growing a lot is Africa in terms of population.
Yeah.
Now, this, I think that increasing debt and also aging populations both are going to put a lot of pressure on a lot of countries to rein in this. And my hope is it'll help rein us in as well.
Maybe so. Yeah. Well, yeah, but that's true. Yeah. Okay. Well, it's been great to having you on here, and hopefully we can, there's certainly, hopefully this will all work out well for everybody involved, and we'll end up with a just peace. Thank you for coming on. Please follow the channel, like this video on YouTube Odyssey, Rumble, and go buy my novel, Escape from the Village. I am Chris Baker, and we are out.